Large language models, in other words, LLMs, are becoming more capable and powerful, and at some point they might start acting independently without any human impact. And we should be prepared for this kind of reality. And that's why it's extremely important to understand what are foundational challenges related to LLMs. Today, our guest, a researcher from Cambridge University, Usman Anwar, will present his work that he conducted together with over 30 other researchers that lays out the foundational challenges of large language models.
Start with why I think studying LLMs and especially especially their safety alignment is important thing to do right now. So if you look at the whole field of AI, it is basically built on a very ambitious but very risky goal of artificial intelligence. You can basically go back up to Turing and Minsky and so on, and people have basically been sort of been hypothesizing, fantasizing in some sense about kind of a very general purpose technology. And in some sense, LLMs, I believe, look like they are direct precursors to AGI. This is kind of still somewhat controversial, but I think in somewhat significant majority of scientists think, yes, yeah, they are kind of direct precursors to AGI. Peter Norvig and Blaise Aguirre, who are at Google, they were both VPs at Google. They think they wrote this article where they actually sort of made the statement that GPT-4 level technologies, they're already in some sense primitive forms of AGI. And you basically have a paper that sort of became quite popular from Sebastian Buback and has Eric Roberts as one of the authors. All of these people are very accomplished researchers. And Sebastian in particular is someone who has a very strong theoretical background. He's not kind of a deep learning practitioner in some sense, sort of started working in learning theory a long while back, and basically has pivoted more and more into LLMs recently. But he has a very strong profile, and he basically has become quite convinced of potential of LLMs as technology, basically, and so on, the paper as well. So the kind of the important or the point to understand here is that, okay, so we have been wanting AGI-ish technologies, and we have now something which we can call general purpose technology. The point is that, okay, what should we be doing now, basically? This work sort of argues that the fact that we're quite close to or we have discovered LLMs which are pretty general purpose technology means that we now should try and orient our field of the whole field of machine learning towards three things. We want to understand the models, these models like LLMs, we want to understand their risks, and then finally want to understand how can we potentially mitigate or manage these risks. In some sense, up till LLMs were here, the whole field of AI safety was in some sense a pre-science field. You could there were people thinking about safety and alignment, but it was often from a very abstract way, and there was sort of often not any kind of scientific validity of those thinking patterns. But now I think with LLMs, what we can do is sort of a transition from this kind of a pre-science to normal science field. And once sort of we are there, this requires that we basically start focusing a lot on scientific validity of research. Basically, we can no longer be tolerating kind of half-baked ideas and basically blogs being written as sort of the gold standard of the field. We should basically be more motivated towards ensuring that our research is valid and our thinking is basically grounded in the right things. Basically, has three kind of observations on which we basically built on. The first observation is that if you look at the LLM safety alignment, this should be tending to all forms of risk and harms. These include accidental risks. These also include intentional risks, which are primarily misuse risks. Also systematic risks. For example, you can often have a key problem with current LLMs is that they are often have different quality of varying quality of services across different populations, especially with respect to languages. For example, if you go to the African languages, for example, these LLMs are pretty bad actually right now. And you also want to care about how they might impact society as a large. For example, these LLMs might lead to high amount of job losses. They might lead to corporate capture. They might cause kind of existential risk scenarios. So you want to also avoid them at all. It is also important that this safety field, while we expect it to have grounding in machine learning, should be interdisciplinary and be welcoming to people from the field as well. And finally, which is the most important point, is that techno-solutionism alone cannot be a solution, basically. LLMs, the technology are always going to be somewhat imperfect. So if you really want to create a good solution to them, then we need to basically go beyond just sort of thinking of technology as a solution, but also sort of think of other ways we can potentially manage these risks and where we can mitigate these risks in some ways. I'm going to now give us sort of a very incomplete overview of the work, basically. So as I said before, it's a pretty long paper. There are 100 plus pages of content. The main sort of thing we do is basically talk about 18 challenges, and this is called the challenges foundation because at least in my own very personal opinion, I don't see CFT or LM CFT succeeding if these challenges don't get solved. We also the other sort of the interesting thing we do is that we basically actually carve out concrete research questions for each of the challenges that people can take and work on, in my opinion. Again, it's a very large collaboration, a lot of effort and time into it. So what we basically have done in some sense is that we have taken these very abstract ideas from making LLM safer, and we have converted them into a concrete research challenges. And what we're hoping that that community and people like you in the audience can do is they can help us solve the challenges, and that we believe can in turn help make LLMs safer. So what are the 18 challenges? This is a very dense slide, so I'm going to try and spend a slight amount of time on this. So we basically talk about that three kind of meta challenges. The first meta challenges with LLMs is that we don't really understand them at all. We basically have in some sense kind of were lucked out as we discovered LLMs, but it's not through any kind of theory-driven research. Basically, it was just kind of in some sense intuition-driven research plus some stroke of nature that's wow, we found transformer, and transformer was something that we were able to scale up reasonably efficiently. And second thing, so issue here is that while our deployment and development methods, they are basically very, very error prone and kind of not at the level we want them to be. And finally, these LLMs are going to become kind of a widespread technology. So they are often they are very likely to create interesting as well as very complex challenges for whole society. And we need to counter them. Going back to the first sort of the meta challenge, scientific understanding, we here talk about 7 things in particular. And the first thing we talk about is that in context learning. So in general, when we talk about learning, we often are able to understand that, okay, we are going to specify some learning algorithm, we're going to specify some data, and we're going to specify some sort of a learning objective, basically. And these sort of things can act as constraints in some sense. With context learning, we basically have no idea what the implicit objective is. We have no idea what the implicit optimization process is. And in some sense, it is entirely black box. And what this means is we have a very limited kind of ability to understand what might happen inside an LLM that is doing synchronous learning, basically. Capabilities is kind of a very often used term, but unfortunately, so we sort of talk about this fact in our paper, is that it's a kind of a concept which has not been scientifically defined yet. And as a result, we are often basically when talking about capabilities, people are often talking past each other. People have different conceptions what a capability is, and as a result, they are having trouble estimating them. We're having trouble kind of convincing each other whether a given LM has a certain ability or not even. So we have scaling laws, but scaling laws are basically gonna often track very high level quantities. They don't track low level skills or level capabilities, and this actually is a pretty big problem because often what we care about is not the macro loss, but the kind of the actual capability that it originates or causes gives way to. And then reasoning capabilities of LLMs, they're often talked about whether they are capable of reasoning or not. If you look at the literature carefully, it turns out that they are capable of reasoning, but it is often very patchy and very imperfect. The key question here is that should we expect future LLMs to be equally kind of patchy at reasoning, or should we expect these are kind of imperfections to go away with time and with future models? So to do that, I believe we need to understand what gives rise to these capabilities in some sense, and to understand develop not a very fine-grained understanding, but at least a qualitative understanding of what reasoning capabilities LLMs have and can have. And then we often talk about agentic LLMs. One sort of basically agentic LLMs have kind of a thing where they can act as amplifier of risk, basically. With chat models, your risks are somewhat bounded in the sense that it can't really act on something on its own. It basically can only act on things through the human in some sense, and human in the loop is in some sense ensuring that things don't go out of hand very much. But with agentic LLMs, there's like no such guarantee. There's no human in the loop anymore. The other consequence of this like agentic LLM stuff is that these LLMs, when like deployed, will likely be interacting with each other in various ways, and we have like absolutely no idea how to ensure safety of these multi-agent kind of systems and so on. And like seventh which section is about like safety performance trade-offs. This is a concept that people have like talked about before in different words. People have called alignment tax and so on. We don't, like so the idea here is that I think people are familiar with the fact that like base models often have more capabilities in our informal way of speaking than the fine-tuned RGF models in some sense. So like when you take RGF model, that in some sense incurs an alignment tax. But this is not the only type of alignment tax you can sort of think of. There are like various different kinds of trade-offs that exist. And these are like not kind of unique to LM systems. They basically like exist in any engineering system. If you take like a very simple kind of control engineering system, even there you can sort of find like a safety performance trade-offs and so on. Yeah, I'm gonna skip like the other two sections, but I think you can. The idea here is that again, often like the challenges are kind of like even when they're like very complex and require like kind of a community-wide effort to solve them. One point I want to make here is that there's kind of uncertainty in the field that you require like kind of like a special expertise to work on LMs. I believe this is just like wrong. And I think there are opportunities to contribute to LM safety and alignment for everyone. And this is like regardless of interest and background. And it's like one of the key points I want to really make in this like the kind of this talk. So imagine that you are deep learning theory researchers. So like, people sort of imagine that like LLMs, oh, they're just like so far apart from like theory that you can basically do no theory on them at all, basically. This is completely false. If, for example, synchronous learning, there's like no learning theory at all for what synchronous learning really is. And this is the kind of point where we make again and again in section 2.1 about this is the fact that like we need a learning theory for synchronous learning. For example, one the question we can ask here is that to what extent prompting is a universal function approximator, and then like we can sort of like think about what kind of bounds exist here, what kind of things can be approximated, what kind of things can't be approximated, and so on. Section 2.2 again talks about capabilities. Again, if we feel like there is a need to develop kind of a measurement theory for LMs, and it again requires kind of like a theory-driven contributions and so on. Like scaling laws is kind of obvious here. Understanding if you are someone from theoretical computer science background, I think you will like have a lot of like fun trying to think about and trying to understand what are the limits of transformers, like what can transformers express, and then consequently what can they learn, and especially as part of with regard to what algorithms they can like learn and express and so on.
It's interesting that you wrote about computational limits of transformers. Transformers became like so by default architecture that you even like basically it's perceived as by default thing for LLMs. But there are like other alternatives as well, right? Like Griffin.
Just to respond to that, I think that there's a locked in the ecosystem basically has like put in so much effort in like optimizing transformers, the infrastructure for transformers, that I feel like there's gonna already a lock-in that like strongly favors transformers, unless you basically come up with kind of a architecture which has like a much higher level of efficiency than transformers. I feel like the kind of the effort has been put into like making transformers work so well in infrastructure would like bias the results strongly in favor of transformers basically. And transformers actually are kind of a very great architecture actually as well. Like I don't think any other architecture people have sort of come up with like kind of matches like the performance that transformers can give. Yeah, but I think things kind of slightly like going into like into the weeds right now. Yeah, so the main point I want to make is that like even like theory researchers can like work on transformers here, and they will find like a very interesting things to work on. Look at someone who's like a very traditional deep learning researcher, like does some practice, does some very small amount of theory as well, and so on. I think again you can sort of find things that they can find things to work on here. For example, OD generation is kind of a very typical deep learning problem. And that problem is like that's like not gone away in some sense. We basically that problem basically has sort of like changed gone from like a pre-training stage OD generation to now the fine-tuning stage of OD generation and the fine-tuning stage. Like how does RHF generalize? How can you sort of ensure that we unlearn different things and so on. So again, like these are the problems are like sort of like taken different form, but they are kind of like still there in some sense. And at pre-training stage, again, there are a bunch of different ways I feel like you can contribute towards, I mean, and safety. I think like just developing kind of better methods for data filtering, better methods to like understand like what data gives rise to capabilities, and in some sense like giving us thinking about architectures that are basically like help can potentially help with downstream efforts towards safety and alignment. Again, can be like really beneficial here and like a kind of a and it's basically an area that is being ignored in a very that's being ignored by almost all entire community in my opinion. If you are someone who's a deep researcher and like you like try to work on like empirical understanding things through empirical means, again like a bunch of things for you to work on, understanding the why understanding emerges, understanding like how can you elicit capabilities, how do different methods like differ in the power to elicit capabilities, understanding like how representations change under the effect of scale, understanding like what train dynamics of LLMs are understanding like how does fine tuning changes LLMs, and so on. I think there are a bunch of problems again here for you to work on. If you're someone from like a security background, again like you and I think this is kind of like a thing which is pretty obvious in most opinion. Like tier-based prompt injections are kind of the most popular topic right now, but they're not the only thing. For example, like poisoning is another kind of a very critical area that is being not being worked on by enough people, in my opinion. Understanding like the cybersecurity capabilities of LLMs. If you look at Google has a paper called Model Evaluations for Extreme Risks, and like one of the dangerous capabilities they identify is the ability of LLMs to identify and exploit cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So again, like just like evaluating that, I don't think I have seen enough kind of good efforts towards measuring cybersecurity capabilities of LLMs in this regard. And like the one sort of the thing I want to highlight here is that like about LLM agents, one sort of very weird thing about LLM agents is that traditional agents in reinforcement learning, for example, they're often like not optimizing in the deployment. But LLM agents will, of course, be based on LLMs, and LLMs can do synchronous learning. And the one sort of the consequence of this synchronous learning is that they will often be optimizing and learning even in deployment. This sort of creates a kind of a very weird kind of a problem where like you can no longer have strong faith in your monitoring systems because they can be sort of like reward hacked in deployment in some sense. And like what you really want here is like a kind of a in some sense industrially robust monitoring of LLM agents. And again, I think this is something that's like security researchers can like contribute here a lot.
Usman, I'm wondering, do you have some examples of the poisoning LLM? What that entails?
So I don't have an example here, but like there's a paper from Nicholas Carlini where they like actually poison image models. What they do is they basically like go on Wikipedia and like basically like devise an attack where they like replace like some sort of captions on Wikipedia when just before like the some like targeted party was going to like download images from them from Wikipedia, and sort of in this way they basically can like insert a backdoor to the model. And the kind of the idea of poisoning in general is that like you if you can poison a model, you often can like insert a backdoor, and to this backdoor you basically can like have in some sense have a privileged access to the model that like other people might not have. Yeah, again like so I want this section I think is like a the main sort of point we're making here is that like most of the work on poisoning has been worked on done by computer vision people, and like not a lot of people in NLP and machine learning people have like worked on it and like sort of applied that to LLMs here, and that basically is kind of a very open area of research in my opinion. One sort of example is that like Anthropic came out of a paper called CPU Agents paper. The paper was like primarily sort of aimed at studying deception in AI agents, but like the way they sort of like studied deception was through like poisoning the model intentionally. But like yeah, so these models can be poisoned. We sort of know that, but like we still want to understand like to what extent like a real world adversary can poison these models. That is basically kind of an open question, and like sort of like no one has an answer to this as far as I know. Again, like the example I gave, they are primarily people in technical communities or like in sort of machine learning and machine learning adjacent communities. But I think like even like people from outside these communities have like opportunities to contribute towards LM safety. I think like ML researchers and social scientists in particular, we need these collaborations to understand the kind of the social risks that these models give rise to. For example, like you can sort of think about malicious user research. These often are the malicious users people think of are often like not just kind of a CS related, but often kind of like in some sense related to other fields like biology or chemistry. This is kind of a natural avenue for people from those backgrounds to come in and like help out with research here. LLM powered misinformation again, like so misinformation is kind of its whole field at the moment. People like been working on misinformation for like decades now, basically. So yeah, so again, like kind of a very nice sort of avenue for collaboration between LLM researchers and these people who have been working on this kind of a niche problem, but like that has become kind of a mainstream now due to LLMs in some sense. I think like one sort of in particular thing I want to highlight here is that I think like we need a lot of like political scientists coming and thinking about like how LLMs can impact political and governance systems. We in particular want to sort of highlight surveillance and censorship. So traditionally, when you have surveillance or censorship, this happens primarily through like a human means. But LLMs like allow kind of an avenue to like automate this kind of a thing basically at a large scale. For example, like imagine that. So for example, imagine that you want to monitor webcams. That basically kind of have been CCTV monitoring. That basically has been limited by the human factor. Like humans were like just like not enough humans to man these cameras. But now with like the computer technologies, like we basically can like process like a very large scale, large amounts of footage very quickly. So like this has sort of given rise to kind of a wider scale adoption of CCTV cameras, and basically kind of like has given rise to monitoring through like automated means. Basically, I expect a very similar kind of an effect to happen with LMs as well, where like you could imagine like a censorship becoming kind of much more easier and to do. And this, I think, in particular, will like impact countries that are vulnerable to like military takeovers or dictatorships and other kind of like totalitarian regimes. And like people sort of so one sort of very important point I want to make here again is that like sort of people feel that RHF has solved the accidental risk scenario. I don't think it has. For example, like LMs are still often like biased. It's just that they're like very, very good at hiding their biases. So again, so Word sort of has kind of a clear dynamic where like it is like a traditional machine learning people. It's just like the ways we can sort of think about biases is in some sense a limited way, and as a result, we are often like unable to like probe beyond kind of certain level. But if you like bring in people from other fields, from sociology, they can like come up with like novel and interesting ways to judge biases. And I think like you can like catch different biases that are basically would like not be caught otherwise. I think a good example here is that LLMs often have kind of a dialect bias. So we in machine learning people like they often like don't have. I don't think I've seen enough kind of efforts towards understanding like biases towards different dialects. But like people have sort of like shown this now, especially people from like a somewhat like social background. I think that like LLMs do tend to have these kind of like biases towards different accents and different sort of dialects. And I think like privacy is again kind of a very important topic, and privacy needs a kind of a whole rethinking, in my opinion, with LLMs. Like privacy can no longer just be about like privacy with the training data, but like we need to think about like when LLMs are interacting with different parties, how do they ensure like privacy in those scenarios and so on. Yeah, and like one sort of a thing that we need to be really, really careful about is over reliance. One like a very natural kind of outcome of using LLMs is that you can basically come to like trust them in a way which is like not valid. I think here again, like you basically need sort of contributions from people in human computer interaction field, or like people who have been thinking about user interfaces a lot, and how can like we ensure that people like not like over rely on LLMs and like don't like develop a kind of a very strong dependency on LLMs in ways which is harmful.
Usman, can you please elaborate for me what the over reliance I just like first time I see this term. Like, can
Yeah,
you elaborate on this?
yeah, very happy to. So the idea of over-reliance is that uh, imagine that you've been using LLM in one context. In this one context has been like performing very, very well. And so now basically you sort of like in that context, you were sort of imagine you were an expert. So you were able to like understand like, okay, is LLM doing well or not? And by your assessment, it was doing well. Now, because LLMs are general purpose technology, you might be tempted to use them in some other context. And in that context, you might actually have like low levels of expertise. And LLM's expertise level also might be lower and they might be bad in that sense. But because you sort of have a prior towards thinking that LM generally is kind of solid and is kind of good, you might like rely on its kind of output in that other context in a way which is like not which is like harmful basically. And it's like actually to be we are like not so we have like not introduced this kind of a harms or reliance is something that people have like been thinking about for a while. I think even like in GPT-4 report, they like talk about like harms from over-reliance. Even like going back before that, there have been works on understanding like how user technologies can like basically give it over-reliance and like what kind of like over-reliance harms can happen and so on.
I can imagine this with students. This might be a problem that students, instead of doing like research on some historical facts, they will just trust what on like LLM output about some historical events without doing additional research.
So it was like a last section of my presentation. This is a very long work. So how should you engage with this work? So you might be sort of tempted to like read it cover to cover. I don't think that's like is the best sort of the way to engage with this work. Just because like how big it is. What you should do, I believe, is you should like sort of like so the work has a lot of structure to this. And in addition to the structure, we have provided like several reading aids. You should like make use of these structure and the reading aids to like ensure you get the most out of this work. For example, like in the start of the document, we provided this guide. This sort of like talks about like who should read what and in what way should they read what parts and so on. For each sort of meta challenges or each section, we have kind of a table up front that summarizes each section. I should sort of like caution that like reading these summaries alone should not be will not be enough. I believe because like by nature this is kind of a very compressed version of those sections. Those sections often have a lot more details, and often the discussion is much more nuanced than you will anticipate. And yeah, and basically often have a very concrete research questions towards the end of the sections that I believe you should like have a look at. And if you like find some question interesting, we tend to have a backlinks at the end of these questions. You can use these backlinks to go to the relevant discussion within the main text of the section. Yeah, and that's kind of can be the one way I would recommend like engaging this work. One possible workflow for this then can be where you basically like start with your desk guide. You read the chapters on introduction chapter, read the chapters introduction chapter-wise introductions. You read like the summary tables. You find some sort of topic that's like aligns with your interests. You try and like read through that challenge, and you can also like either like keep on repeating this, or you can like find something interesting to work on from there, and like yeah, and basically go and like make LM safer.
The main emphasis of this work is around large language models and safety around LLMs. I recently spoke with Pranav. I don't know if Pranav is here. He said that when he was at ACML like a few weeks ago, like 70% of work was dedicated to LLM, and like the rest, like 30%, was how to use small amount of data to make LLM efficient. Like how to, if you don't have access to large data. So it's basically all about LLMs. But there are other domains in machine learning, right? Like robotics, reinforcement learning agents. So are those safety principles, they also apply to these other domains?
I think it is also already happening and will basically be more prominent in the future. There will be a convergence towards LLMs. For example, like robotics is kind of a field where you can imagine like LLMs acting as kind of the high level planners And then you basically have like kind of a very specialized low-level policies being trained using information learning to like I don't know, carry out the actual manipulation tasks and so on. Computer vision is its own separate field, but like we already are like moving towards a domain where like we have all LLMs kind of are like natively vision LLMs, like they are include the vision capabilities as well. And so I sort of feel like there's a convergence happening throughout machine learning towards LLMs, where like things sort of become like are kind of like the in some sense LLMs are at the central kind of the position in my opinion right now in the field, and everything that has all like the safety concerns of LLMs basically will come to like dominate all systems that we sort of think are in machine learning right now.
Also, in the presentation, you mentioned about we don't have like qualitative understanding of reasoning. Maybe a question to everyone: do we have qualitative understanding of human reasoning? Basically, if we do have, then probably we can achieve the same for AI. But like if we can't, if we don't have it for human reasoning, how we can achieve it for AI reasoning?
So I generally think that anthropomorphizing LLMs is often not very helpful. Especially, I think we should have higher bar for LLMs than we have for humans or like understanding humans basically. So one sort of like a very kind of an obvious benefit or like advantage we have with LLMs is that we can like sort of open them up in a very kind of any weird way we want to open them up and study the internal mechanisms basically. We often can't do that with human. So in that some sense, I don't think the criteria that like if we have like not understood some aspect about humans means that we will not understand that same aspect about LLMs as well. And I think that I'm actually not an expert on this, but I do think that we have some reasonable level of understanding of qualitative understanding of human reasoning. For example, all the standardized tests, etc., for example, they are like based on some sort of theory. You could argue like how good those theories are and like whether like they are kind of like a meaningful or not. But I think they must have some merit. Like we are using like SAT and GREs to like decide very important things in the world. That's a good question. I don't have an answer like to what extent like we understand human reasoning abilities. But I don't think like it's a good excuse to not understand LLM capabilities in any case.
I was actually thinking about all of these replacing LLMs with dogs. How well do we understand, how well dogs, learn and reason and so on. And the reason I thought that was kind of useful is not the anthropomorphizing part, but it's because we're studying a really complex system. It's a system that we understand 100% at the lowest level. We know exactly how these models are working at the lowest level, but we don't really have the tools to understand the complexity, at the high level. And that's similar to a lot of natural systems as well. We have very good physical laws, at the atomic level, but once we start getting into molecules, we start having to use heuristics. And when we talk about entire cells, it's not that we don't understand, the lowest level stuff. It's that it's very hard to figure out how that works at that level of complexity. So it seems like, well, there's also a race going on here, and that by the time you get a little bit of a handle on something that exists, it's, the field will have moved on to something else. But anyway, to me, that seemed very irrelevant because all of those really seem to be, addressing how do we understand complex systems.
I think we do understand some complex systems, like for example, airplanes. They're very complex. We can sort of assure the safety. Regarding human body, drugs is another example. Like we do have found ways to ensure that like we already is kind of an external kind of an organism or like kind of the I don't know, like the drug to your body or chemical to your body. We sort of like know often to very high kind of degree of confidence like what it will do to you. So even though you're very complex, so you have like sort of like a found ways to like think about very important things in ways that we can ensure safety and useful outcomes. I agree that like complexity is a big challenge, but I don't think like there's a kind of a need to be as pessimistic as like, I don't know, people feel like they should be. I think there needs to be optimism in some sense that like, yeah. And again, like as I said before, like these models like afford us kind of the new affordances to understand them. That's why it's not available with other systems. Like for example, again with dogs, I can't just like train a new dog immediately, but I can, in some sense, given sort of like the not like economic constraints, I can train sort of like a large number of different LMs. And I think, for example, like of a search called Physics of LMs happening at Facebook Research, where the searchers are taking exactly this sort of approach. Basically, they like train like a bunch of different LMs on different kind of data and try to understand like, okay, what really happens if we do this thing, that thing, blah blah. I'm very optimistic about understanding LMs, and I think like we should be optimistic, and we should like not be kind of just like giving up at the start.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue for giving up by any means. I will say that, the general approach, you could think of it this way, of understanding compounds is you develop a model of the system, of the part that you're, something that captures the essence of the question you're studying. Sometimes these are our conceptual models. We understand, well, drugs was an example. It feels like we have very poor understanding of, um, but we do develop models at different levels of granularity that capture some of the essential elements. So one answer to how to approach all those is people need to develop models. They can be different forms. It can be but something that allows us to understand what happens, what the consequences are from the model. Um, and the model wouldn't be like it's an LLM. It would be like a higher level, simplified. Models are simplifications of complex systems, right? That break
Yeah.
things down into simpler pieces that allow us to draw valid inferences.
I don't think we need to understand LLMs as like incompleteness. For example, I sort of disagree with the goal of the field of mechanistic integrability, where they like want to like understand and like sort of like understand everything about LLM. I feel like that's a very lofty goal, and I'm not sure how I feel about its chances. But I think we do need to understand some very key aspects of LLMs. These are like what sort of like my section one in my paper is basically like those things. I talk about the fact that we need to understand like inference learning. We need to understand reasoning capabilities. We need to understand like the fact of scale. We understand about hard estimate capabilities. So I think like to me these are the four kind of essential things, and anything like more than that will be a bonus. But like even like these four things basically is kind of like very hard to do. Like yeah, I think we can sort of make traction. We can sort of like make progress on kind of coming in from like a kind of a very like understand everything perspective, but like hey, let's just really understand like this particular thing, basically kind of perspective can make progress on things.
We're trying to make this analogy with airplanes, but we don't expect airplanes to think, right, and make decisions. But with AI, we do expect that they somewhat will be act autonomously and will make like wise decisions, and those decisions will be benefiting the entire humanity. And I think maybe it's not like mistake that community is making, but maybe I don't know if there's if the community understands that AI is like completely new field, and there are like challenges that we never faced before that we have to somehow solve, and just draw analogies only to regulating nuclear power or regulate or how we build airplanes. I mean, we can learn something from those experiences, but there will be new challenges that we never faced before, and we have to somehow deal with them. And I don't know if AI community understands that.
I agree with this. I think this is like kind of the national side here. One thing I do want to like sort of point out is that like airplanes, most of them are often like autopilots are kind of an example of like airplanes thinking, but thinking is kind of constrained. We often like don't worry about systems thinking about it themselves. The reason like I think we need to like be very careful about LMs is that they can think in like in a much more general ways than other systems possibly can, even like other machining systems. Like for example, like one sort of thing I want to compare to like right now is like LMs versus differential models. So the differential models are like basically kind of equally impressive in some sense. So you have like a kind of the mid journey of stable diffusions, but they're like not in some sense like scary because they are like and still like very specialized. They're like not very general purpose in some sense, but while LLMs are. So I think this is the kind of the general degree of autonomy. The things are very as a point you have made so far is kind of a thing that we basically is novel to us and is all of these like these systems, and yeah, that presents kind of a very new area of challenges.
Which problems like possible to address in the near future? And you see that AI and startup community already trying to solve those problems. And what problems you think will be much harder to solve, and maybe even it's questionable if it's even possible to solve them?
Regarding all these problems, I have like different levels of optimism for all of them. Regarding problems like the startup community is really focusing on, I think they are focusing very heavily on valuations, which is challenge 10 here. They are focusing very heavily on challenge 12, jailbreaks. Regarding what challenges that the startups will solve, maybe 12 is the thing that I feel like is sort of most being invested on or most being worked on by startups. That's you can sort of expect to be solved by them. But there is kind of like it's a very kind of a hard problem. We have like not solved that in vision for despite like something like 10 years of research. I'm not sure like how optimistic I am with the continuous like being fundamentally solvable in some sense. So I think the community is like, as sort of you also mentioned, is very focused on development deployment methods. So I think things in that region are basically being worked on at a much higher velocity than the things like in the other two sort of sections. So I think like things like I think understanding LMs is kind of as a whole remains kind of for me the kind of the most hard problems, and expect that like to be solved like I don't know like in a very steady but slow way over time. I think like the section 6 multi-agent safety, I think like we basically are like pretty bad at thinking about multi-agent safety at the moment. So I think like thinking about that would be very important. I think understanding like effect of scale section 3 is very important and not something we are like doing enough effort towards. Yeah, section 7, static performance trade-offs. I think that again is kind of a very important thing to understand about LLMs. Like, yeah, like what sort of knobs exist for us, like basically trade-off performance for safety and so on. We have like sort of like found some knobs, but like presumably like a lot more knobs exist, and we have like yet to like understand them or discover them. Yeah, and I think on the last sort of column side, I think sections 17 regarding understanding like how LLMs might impact society and economic systems. I think that basically is kind of a very grand challenge, and that might sort of we need to basically be investing a lot more efforts in. And that sort of includes, for example, you mentioned previously like the overlines in education. That actually we sort of include under this section 17. Basically, AI for education is kind of a very important thing to work on. The things like, for example, like one thing that might happen is that LLMs might like exaggerate the global like the economic disparity in the world basically across countries, because like sort of you can I think up to like something like 2019 2017 less than 50% of the world had access to internet basically. That figure has like improved since then, but like not improved like in a very like very kind of that issue is solved way. So if you don't even have access to kind of internet, you by sort of the by kind of the by definition not have access to LM basically right now. And that basically means that like you might have kind of a situation where like rich countries they sort of get like how much richer because like they can sort of have much higher economic productivities because the people they are using LMs. LMs themselves are becoming kind of very vital units of economic, and the lower income countries or poor countries in the world right now, they usually keep on kind of like a slide further down the poverty because like the technology disparity has improved even further, for example. So I think there are kind of like a lot of like these kind of scenarios that we actually discussed in section 17 that like might have like very bad and somewhat like I'm like not sure how to solve them kind of challenges basically. And I think a lot more people should be working on them.